Great, thanks a lot.
Okay.
All right. Well then, let's get started. So I'm going to talk today about React apps replacing Drupal modules. We call this our Brown D React. I'm from Brown University, and I'll give you a little bit of background information on myself just to get started. My name is James Morton. I have a degree in software engineering from Queen's University in Canada. And then immediately after coming out of school, as you do, I ran a martial arts school for 4 years. So I didn't go right into development. And then I did some independent web development and also was a full-time stay-at-home dad for a while. This will become important later because to let you know, coming into my current position, I had 0 Drupal experience. So for anybody who doesn't know, Drupal is a web hosting content management system. We use it for our websites at Brown. We have hundreds of sites under Drupal 6, 7, and 8 at this point. When I say D6, D7, D8, just different versions of Drupal. And React is a powerful JavaScript library for front-end interfaces. If I'm going too fast again, feel free to tell me to slow down. So here's how this all came about. We started an initiative to update all of our sites at Brown from Drupal 6 and Drupal 7 into Drupal 8. We decided to use Acquia and move them all into Acquia Cloud Site Factory, which is a multi-site hosting platform, if anybody's not familiar with it. So we discovered there were many collected Drupal 6 and 7 modules, which had sort of built up over the years, that were one-offs. They didn't really need to be modules. Whoever was managing the site at the time just decided to make them modules. They didn't really need database access to the Drupal database and the sites they were hosted on. They didn't take advantage of Drupal really in any way except to be displayed on the page. When we discovered this, we recognized that we just didn't have the bandwidth or, to be honest, the experience to rebuild all of these modules in a reasonable time frame in Drupal 8, especially since when I started working on this project, we launched our new site in March of last year. And around that time, I started working on the project. And then in June, the lead of the project left. And the other member working on the project went on 6 weeks paternity leave. So I was left to deal with some issues and muddle my way around Drupal 8 a bit. And I decided that I'd have enough and didn't want to rewrite somewhere between 10 and 20 Drupal 8 modules. So we decided to come up with a different solution. We decided to try for the simplest solution. So since these modules basically just needed to be displayed, they didn't need that back-end access, we thought, why don't we use React apps? So React is great at making these one-off modules that don't require that back-end. It's very useful for taking in data, processing it, and being able to live edit it and then send out the results. So for example, a form is really good. You can pull data in if you need to from an API source using a JavaScript HTTP library like Axios or whatever. You bring it in, you send a post data out, you're great. You don't have to worry about the integration with Drupal's backend that all the modules would have to deal with. At that time, we were also converting our web project development strategy to be basically React front end only. All new projects were being developed in React as a front end. So we had started building a library of reusable React components. To give you just a quick overview of the kind of thing we were doing. We had styled buttons, styled form elements, headers, footers, different elements of a page that could just be pulled immediately into a new app. So we could basically spin up a more or less finished app with all these components, and you just had to add in the functionality that the app was unique for. Since we were already building this library, we decided to try and figure out a way to use them to rebuild all of these modules instead of having to go through the process of dealing with that Drupal 8 integration and basically bringing our developers up to speed with Drupal 8 to a point where we could churn out those modules fast enough. So one of the advantages of these React applications is they're simpler and faster to write. Now, I mean, that's a kind of a blanket statement that I have there, but if you are equivalent experienced in Drupal and React, it's easier to come up with these applications that don't require that back-end integration than it is to create a simple, for example, a simple one-off form custom module. There are form builders and so on that are useful, but a custom form module for a single specific form is the kind of thing that we're running into, and it's just way easier to do that in React with this library of reusable components. So we had some challenges. So the first challenge was, okay, we've got React apps, how do we get them into the pages? We decided that the best way to get these apps ready for this was, instead of having multiple files per application, we would take the applications, build them out as we needed to using a blueprint that we could easily spin up a new app and then just start writing it. Use those that library of components, and then take all of those and combine them into a single JavaScript file. So uglify them down. Each application, we gave a unique name, of course, too, but the name was changed via a config file that we're using. Then that becomes important later because we actually use that config file to not only identify the app, but to generate the location where the React app will attach itself into in the code in the page. And whoops, sorry, I need to go back one here. So the React applications are basically just JavaScript files that find an element in HTML. So they grab a div with an ID and replace it with themselves. Excuse me. So our major constraint here was, you know, how are we going to get this? Where are we going to put it? We decided to use a custom paragraph type. This probably is not the most efficient generic way to do this, but because of, and you'll see this in a minute, I'm going to give a demo. Because of the way our project was already structured, it was the most efficient for us to use a paragraph type to inject these applications. So what I did was write a single Drupal module, which allowed the user to grab from a list of all of these applications and just pick one, and it would render it in this page. The name of the app that we talked about earlier in the config was what was used to create the div in the paragraph type that the app attached itself to. So right now, I'm going to stop sharing this, and I'm going to pull up this. So this is my local environment. It's just a very basic page with our structure in it. And I'm just going to show you the process for doing this via the admin interface. And again, please feel to interrupt me with questions if you have any, feel free. So I'm just going to start by adding a basic page. just need a title. So here's the reason that we chose to use a paragraph. In this below content components area of the Drupal basic page content type, we have this list of paragraph types. So what we did was we created a paragraph type and attached it to the list for the React app. That brings us to this screen. You can select from the list of applications. In this case, I'm just going to add a basic one here. This app config box is deprecated. It's been replaced by this key value pair, but we still have it in use in some places, which is why it's still there. And we also have this ability to pass user data to the apps as we need to. All I have to do now, once I've selected the app that I want, this one is not going to require any config, so I'm not going to give it any, is just save. And the page immediately has the form injected, the application injected into the page content, and it renders as you would expect. Any questions about that? Too fast, too slow? All right. I will jump back into presentation. So that was the first challenge solved. The second challenge is, okay, so we know how we're going to embed them. How do we deploy them? Well, again, we had a couple of choices and we made one that was the best at the time. We need to be able to deploy new apps, make changes to apps, and make improvements to the module. But one of our guiding principles for this was to maintain the decoupled status of the apps. And what I mean by that is that they shouldn't depend on Drupal. They shouldn't depend on the Drupal version. All they should depend on is being passed any JSON configuration, which is in those configuration fields I showed you, and I'll talk a little bit more about those later. All it should be dependent on is being passed some JSON configuration, and then it should be able to handle everything else itself. So it shouldn't matter where it gets that configuration. So we wanted to maintain that decoupled status of them. So what we did is we put each app in its own repo, and then when the application is built, when you compile it down to a single file, you physically copy it into the module manually and create a new release of the module. So this, again, is not the most efficient way to do this. There are certainly other ways. We looked at Git submodules. We looked at a few different things. But we decided to do it this way because we wanted the developers to really think about what they were doing. So this sort of adds an extra step into it. So when somebody creates an app, they have to copy it. They have to create the app. They have to make all their PRs for that app, pull requests, and have that all accepted. And then they copy the app into the module. Then they have to make a pull request for the module into the module itself. And there's a level of testing with the module in the development environment to make sure the app doesn't break anything and so on. But the advantage of keeping them decoupled, we'll talk about a little bit later. Essentially, that's the reason we decided to do it with copying it manually instead of the other ways, some of which would definitely be more effective. So we needed to pass data to the apps. Well, we started off by passing it a custom JSON string, which you had to write yourself, and that was awful. So instead of that, I built the configuration with the key value pairs so that you could enter a key, enter a value, and it would parse that and create the JSON data for you to pass into the application. The pass data is attached to the JavaScript window object, and then each individual application unsets it. We also passed in the logged in username this way. This brings up one of the possible future improvements to this application, since it would probably be better if we weren't passing it via the window object and passing it in another method. just so that it was a little less dependent on that. So we had another challenge was permissions. And this challenge we didn't actually know was a challenge until it got brought up to us as we need your app to be able to do this. So what we needed was we needed to give certain editors permission to edit the config, but not be able to touch the applications. So we decided to do this through the module as well, and maintaining as best we could a generic build of the module, because again, we didn't really want it to be specifically dependent on anything. We just added abilities for adding and editing. So in this case, I'm actually going to give a little bit more of a demo on that, so I can show you where the where that is handled. So under permissions, when you're editing permissions in the back end, and this is a live demo, I know it's definitely always a good idea to do live demos during presentations. That did not work. Take a second to load here. So under our permissions, we created these two permissions, which are the edit React app config and the insert React app. Basically, the configuration for permissions is handled via these two elements here. So you can see that a unit publisher has the ability to edit the React app config, but not add or remove in the applications. There's not a specific remove one. This one probably could be insert/remove React app, but right now only administrators have the ability to do that. The unit publishers have the ability to edit, but not add or remove. So I'm going to give a little bit more of a demo here, and again, jump in with questions if you have them. So this application is a program integration application that we wrote that pulls in some data and parses it based on what ID you give it. So we actually need to pass it an ID. So in this case, the app is expecting a key in the JSON value called concentration ID. And the value that you give it is sort of arbitrary. I think there are 70 odd concentrations that we're using at the moment. So you pick a value and pass it this key value pair. It's going to take the key value pair and pull in the data based on that ID. In this case, the ID referred to the applied mathematics concentration. So it pulls in, formats, and displays all this data. So, question here. Nathan has a question here. While you're on permissions, are the viewing using the app permissioned as well for the end? So the viewing using the app are not permissioned for the end user at the moment. This is a great question. So going back to the permissions for a moment, we don't have permissions specifically set for that. However, we are going to be implementing the paragraph permissions module, which is part of Drupal 8. And since the React app is embedded in a specific paragraph that only displays these React apps, you can control React app permissions based on the paragraph permissions module. Now, the way Site Factory works is that we're creating multiple different Drupal sites. And like I said, these are mostly one-off apps. So likely there's only going to be one, maybe two of these apps in any given site, which is, again, why we didn't want to take the time to create them in Drupal. We wanted to spin them up quickly and be done with them. So using those paragraph permissions per site is going to mostly give us what we need in terms of locking down permissions on these applications. For the most part, these, though, are things like this, where we need to call an API endpoint, we need to give it a specific ID, and then we need to display the data somehow. So in this case, it's the concentration is applied mathematics. If I go into edit this and I just change this ID, I think one is invalid. Looks like ID number 2 is Africana Studies. So even as I change it, every time it renders, it just live renders the data. So it calls our API endpoint and pulls this in. There are some efficiency things for the API endpoints, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it does re-render the page with the correct data as soon as you save. You save that application with the updated information. All right. So we had it working. We had the permissions going. We had deploys. This is great. This was our MVP. We got our minimum viable product out there. We got it working. We started spinning up these applications and we started churning them out quickly. And then we ran into places we needed to improve this, which is always the way. So the first thing we needed to do is obfuscate or hide our endpoints. This was because in some cases, they wanted to use endpoints which, even though they themselves were public, might allow you to extrapolate other endpoints that we didn't want people to see. So instead of just having the app directly call those endpoints, we implemented a proxy. It's hosted on-prem in a Kubernetes cluster, and it uses GraphQL to handle the data. And GraphQL is basically an endpoint amalgamating system. So you call a single endpoint with a request that has the data you want in it. It picks the right endpoint from a list that it has and hides that interaction from the end user. So that's how we set that up. We also decided in terms of the endpoints that if people were hitting these endpoints a lot, which in the case of most of these applications was unlikely, like it's unlikely for a single concentration to get enough hits to make it a problem in terms of traffic. But even so, all of our endpoints are routed through Cloudflare and are cached. So data endpoints are cached to a certain limit. It could be, some of them, the data is not going to change. Some of them, it changes more regularly, but about a day they're cached. So even if there's a huge influx of traffic to a single one of these applications, they're all hitting a cached endpoint anyways in our CDN. So that's a really, really efficient way to do that, I think. We also discovered that, and this is by discovered, I mean, we had a client say, oh, this is neat. Can we have it do this? Which is, again, usually the way that we end up developing new features. We discovered that we needed a way to embed an app across all pages on one of our sites. So it's a chatbot, basically. We needed it to appear on all non-admin sites. So in this case, we modified the module to allow for a single global config. In this case, this functionality is still in dev, so I can't demonstrate it yet. But what it does is it gives you the opportunity to add a single React app from a list as well. It's just a different folder. It's actually a subdirectory of our apps directory in the module. It allows you to select from a list of apps and add a single one. We decided to limit this one to one because we really didn't want people adding a lot of apps across all pages. Did you have a question? Oh, okay. So this method, advantages, disadvantages, I'll go over a couple of these and then take some questions. We can talk about different opportunities that you see for usage or for extending the functionality here. So first of all, the apps themselves are decoupled. So this means that in however many years when we end up with Drupal 10 or Drupal 11 or anything like that, there's only one module that needs to be rebuilt, and that module just needs to be able to inject these apps into the page. Or if we decide to get away from Drupal entirely, these apps could be spun up on their own in a Docker container in the Kubernetes cluster that we're running, and they would work fine. We really didn't want them to have to use a specific version of Drupal or to depend on any CMS or backend. We wanted to make sure they kept decoupled. They are simple. We have the library of components. There's no config management. I don't know if any of you Drupal experts who are working with Drupal 8 have had some issues with configuration management, but I have spent a long time dealing with configuration split and trying to get configuration split to work properly with individual profiles. So our deploy does use config split to split on profiles instead of environments. And that was a pretty heavy lift. After that lift, we decided, well, I decided that I didn't want to write configuration for modules anymore, or at least not that many. I think we got a question here. Have you ever tried to use blocks to embed the React app? Paragraph is good. So I've got a question. Have you ever tried to use blocks to embed the apps? I have not. And specifically because we wanted that paragraph element to appear in the drop-down list that I showed you. So we didn't, I honestly didn't have that much experience with Drupal when I was building this. So I was kind of blindly forging ahead with it. And the best method I could find for attaching the applications in a way that you could select them from that drop-down list, which was a requirement of our building this. You had to be able to pick the app from that list, was to just embed it in a paragraph type. There's probably much more efficient ways to do this, but in our case, it was the way to get that MVP, that minimum viable product, out and running so that we could move on. Yeah. So back to the advantages. In general, things render faster with React because they're not handling all of the extra baggage. I'm not sure exactly how much this affects it, but I'm sure there is some effect. But there are disadvantages to using this method as well. So the main disadvantage is if we have an application that needs to store data after it has affected it. modules obviously have access to the Drupal, all the Drupal bells and whistles. They have access to the database. They can store data easily. They have access to the objects that the views create that they're in. They have access to all those different things and can modify them and use them. These apps are just being rendered there. They don't have that integrated access. So storing data is a little harder. Again, most of the applications we're working with don't really need to store data. They need to make a post. They need to send an email, or they need to render some data, having pulled some in, or make some calculations and then render some data. But should we need to, we can spin up databases hosted in our Kubernetes cluster and just attach them that way. And security. Yeah, front-end security is definitely more difficult with these ones. It's way easier when they're tightly coupled to hide that data. We use a single sign-on for all of our sites. We use Shibboleth. So being able to lock down stuff is fairly straightforward as long as it's integrated. It's a little less so when you have these decoupled ones. You have to get into using JavaScript authentication libraries and so on. But again, most of them don't need that. So we weighed these disadvantages and decided this was the way to go with it. All right. Just gonna check our chat here.
Yeah, you have a new question.
All righty. How does this contribute to page bloat? Yeah, so that's a really good question. In our case, there is a fair amount of page bloat already for sure. And this will add a little bit to it because it's injecting the entire JavaScript file every time the page is loaded and it's parsed. So yeah, if we had a really significant React application, like something that is incredibly interactive and requires a lot of different functionality and so on, this might not be the best way to do it with the single file and injecting it directly into the page. So it might be better just to outside link it to a React app that's hosted somewhere else. But there's the advantage of this method, is that writing the applications, if we have an app that let's say we have one that we're injecting for a while, and then we decide we need to add that functionality and add it. Eventually we can just say, okay, this is too big. Let's host it separately and just link to it instead. But that's a really good point. Thanks, Dan.
We have about 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. I'll just give some quick examples that we use and then go into questions. So the ask concentrations information at Brown, the concentrations, students declare a concentration, and it has all of that information. It grabs it from the API endpoint via the ID, like I showed you, and parses it on the page. We have financial aid calculators. We have some apps from our registrar. We have a contact form for admissions. We have listing for our courses, and Data Cookbook is a lookup, basically a search find API app. Again, that just, you put in a search term, it hits an API with that term and posts the data. These are the apps we have so far. There are two or three, there are 2 financial aid calculators, and I think 3 or 4 registrar apps. And there are more in development all the time. Basically, as needed, we spin them up. So that is what I have. Does anybody have any questions, any comments? Comments like Dan's question is great because it certainly is a system that is not perfect. It has those advantages of keeping the apps decoupled and not having to write them in Drupal 8, but it definitely has disadvantages, and I definitely should include page bloat in that slide. So thank you for that. So anybody else? Nope. Comments? Anything? Okay. We do have plans. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just saw someone unmute, so I didn't know if they were going to ask a question.
You are very observant. Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm building a Drupal 8 site now that for the version 1, we're just doing Drupal UI because it's easier. But I'm pretty strongly expecting by version 2, we're going to move to decoupled with React. So I was going to presume that you'd be available for follow-on discussions if you're, if somebody like me is looking for some more kind of feedback from somebody who's been in the trenches like you.
Sure, absolutely. One thing to remember, this is not technically decoupled React specifically. Since we're embedding the application in the front end of Drupal, we still are using the Drupal front end. But interestingly, you could embed and again, this would be kind of silly, but if you wanted to, you could embed a React end that is attached, or a React app that is using an API to connect to a Drupal backend, and essentially have a full Drupal headless headless Drupal with React app front end embedded in a paragraph type, which I really don't suggest you do, but it would try to do it.
Right. Okay, that's a good point. But
I'm certainly available for chatting about that kind of thing. Yeah.
Cool.
Great. Yeah, if there's anything else, feel free to speak up. Otherwise, we do have plans to expand this further. And at some point, we're going to release the code on GitHub, on Brown's GitHub. But right now, a couple of the apps, again, have those endpoints that we're trying to obscure. So once we're finished handling all those issues, then I can post the code somewhere for a public Git repo, and everybody can feel free to check it out and use it as you like. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.